Is U.S. opinion shifting on the Israel-Palestine conflict? People opposed to America's long-standing support of Israel are becoming more vocal. So, how will this affect future ties between the two traditional allies? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The latest round of fighting between Israel and Hamas has ended in a ceasefire. More than 250 people died over 11 days. Most were Palestinians killed by Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, while Hamas rockets killed 12 people in Israel. Palestinians celebrated as the Egypt-brokered truce went into force. Both Hamas and Israel are claiming victory. The U.S., Israel's biggest ally, had been putting on the pressure to stop the violence. President Joe Biden reportedly warned Benjamin Netanyahu that he couldn't withstand international criticism of the Gaza strikes for much longer. Gabriel Elizondo has more from Washington, D.C.
President Joe Biden had come under increased pressure over the last week to do more to try to stop the violence, particularly with progressives within the Democratic Party who were calling on Biden to pressure Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to pursue more aggressively a ceasefire. So ultimately, when Biden did announce this ceasefire, he wanted to show that the U.S. was very much involved in it and wanted to take some credit.
We've held intensive high-level discussions, hour by hour, literally. Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, and other Middle Eastern countries, with the aim of avoiding the sort of prolonged conflict we've seen in previous years when the hostilities have broken out. I believe the Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live safely and securely and to enjoy equal measures of freedom, prosperity, and democracy. My administration will continue our quiet, relentless diplomacy toward that end. I believe we have a genuine opportunity to make progress, and I'm committed to working for it.
The question now becomes will the Biden administration use this opportunity to pursue peace with Israel and Palestine in the region? We are getting late word now that Secretary of State Antony Blinken will be heading to the region in the coming days to meet with both the Israelis and Palestinians and regional players to pursue some sort of peace agreement. Where these meetings will take place and with exactly whom is still unknown, but it does give an indication that at least in some degree, Biden does want to seize this opportunity to pursue a more lasting peace in the region.
A shift away from America's long-standing support of Israel appears to be happening. Progressive Democrats such as Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ilhan Omar openly challenged U.S. policies and demanded protection for Palestinians. And Senator Bernie Sanders has introduced a bill to block the sale of $735 million worth of weapons to Israel.
The truth is, these policies, like this current war, will continue to strengthen extremists on both sides, including Hamas. You want to strengthen Hamas, support this war. We, Congress, must understand that in more than a decade of his right-wing rule in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu has cultivated an increasingly intolerant and authoritarian type of racist nationalism.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans, particularly young people, have been rallying in support of Palestinians. A recent Gallup poll found that although most Americans still have favorable views of Israel, a record 25% sympathize more with Palestinians. Another survey found younger American Jews feel less attached to Israel than their parents and grandparents. All right, for more on this, I'm joined by my guests in Washington, D.C., Omar Baddar, member of the National Policy Council of the Arab American Institute. In Al-Bire, Razzan Qur'an, Palestinian activist and doctoral student in psychology. And in New York, Jesse, mechanic, writer, and contributor to publications such as Huffington Post, Mother Jones, and Truth Out. A warm welcome to you all. Razzan, let me start with you today. This citizen journalism that we've seen that's being done by Palestinian activists on the ground there, how much do you think that has changed the conversation and the narrative about the plight of Palestinians in the U.S.? I mean, do you think that this is really shifting perceptions in America, that Americans are beginning to reckon much more with the reality on the ground for Palestinians?
Yes, thank you for this question, and hello to all the viewers today. I definitely think that having personal narratives off the ground, representing and rendering visible what's often very easily concealed by systems of power is very, very influential. I mean, this is the same thing we've seen happen with Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. It was local communities coming together and saying that enough is enough and no justice, no peace, and we have to reflect what's happening on the ground, what is the daily reality. Earlier in your introduction, you were also mentioning how Biden's announcement was saying that both Palestinians and Israelis deserve peace and safety and freedoms. And one thing I would say is I think just as an everyday person, we always hear these kind of epithets and we hear these, they've become kind of like these tropes. And the people on the ground stand up and say, no, actually, we have not seen any ounce of equality in freedoms, in safety since 1948. And that's something very important. And that's what people on the ground, everyday people are doing. They're using their instruments, these tools, to simply say, this is happening outside my window. This is what's happening on my way to school. This is what's happening on my way to harvest land that I've been harvesting for years. And I feel like it humanizes us because so much over the last 73 years, Palestinians have increasingly been dehumanized through means of also just depersonalizing us. So using the label of Palestinian is even more common today and was pretty eliminated and eclipsed in the past. But even doing so, or like Reuters' recent headline of calling the Hamas versus Israel, they're completely depersonalizing our people. And so I think that each individual coming up and speaking about what they're living and experiencing firsthand has been foundational to what we're seeing happening in local and global mobilization.
Ahmad, from your vantage point there in the U.S. Capitol, do you feel that the ground is shifting in the U.S. when it comes to perceptions of what the Palestinians have been through and what they're going through? Is there a new focus on Palestinian rights, and are more people in the U.S. seeing this conflict framed through social justice and the issue of human rights?
There is absolutely no question that we are seeing this very significant shift in public perceptions, in part due to what Razzan herself has just outlined in terms of technology, just giving people access directly into what's happening on the ground in Palestine in a way that does not necessarily always have to be filtered through corporate media in the United States, which still continues to cover this issue not so greatly, still with a lot of false equivalences and missing context. But also, there's a lot of mobilization from the ground up here within the United States. There is grassroots activism in support of Palestinian human rights. There is so many, the diversity of the American Jewish community is now on full display with so many more progressive organizations, Jewish organizations emerging to challenge AIPAC, the traditional pro-Israel lobby. And we are at a point right now where a majority of Democrats favor reducing American military funding to Israel because of Israel's violations of Palestinian human rights. That is a massive, massive shift. This did not used to be the case 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And that is leading us to this moment right now where more and more members of Congress, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, are willing to challenge Israeli behavior and American support for Israeli behavior and demanding that the United States hold Israel accountable. And this is certainly looks like the beginning of a much broader shift, that we're moving in the right direction in a country that is becoming much more socially conscious all around, with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the environmental justice movement, and just about every movement that's trying to create a better and more equitable and just world. And we're seeing that spill into American foreign policy as well.
Jesse, if I may, I want to read from something you wrote and posted on both Twitter and Instagram. There was a post in which you wrote, "For the record, I'm Jewish. I have experienced anti-Semitism. Israel is a U.S.-backed nuclear power running an apartheid state and deploying one of the most advanced militaries on the planet to kill trapped Palestinians in Gaza. That statement isn't anti-Semitic, it's honest." The sentiment that you were expressing there, this is something that I have seen many American Jews grapple with and express in the past couple of weeks. Essentially, what you and many others are saying is that opposing Israeli government policies does not equate to anti-Semitism. What kind of reaction did you get from this post, and was it what you had expected?
That's a very good question. No, to be honest, I put that sentiment out there, and I had been putting, well, I mean, my social media following has gone way up over the past year. Before, when I was just a journalist speaking out about these things, it was more in person to people. But I will say this, I've put out a lot of different messages about justice and equality. And this one absolutely took off. I think everything that's been said thus far is absolutely accurate. There has been a shift. I think it has to do with myriad factors, definitely, which, was already said, social media has played an enormous role. I think it's hard to overstate its influence because even, the last big conflict, 2014, social media wasn't what it was. And not everyone had a camera in their hand. So it really democratizes all that. So yeah, when I put that up, it exploded really. And most of it, there was pushback for sure from pro-Israel people. But what I really am trying to do with speaking out about this is to decouple all that, right? To separate the fact that you can criticize the right-wing Israeli government and the occupation of Palestine and the settlements, which have been there for, over 50 years now. And you're not criticizing Jewish people. They're two entirely different things. And I've tried to reiterate that even after that post. But I will say this, the support that post has got has been absolutely incredible and way beyond anything that I had imagined for it. I thought it would just kind of be like some other ones. And I thought there was a possibility that it would just get a ton of hate. Because, in the United States, I think it's actually more accepted to criticize your own government, right? Especially right now. I mean, we can speak out, people speak out about injustices that we're perpetrating, that the US military is perpetrating, that the US government is perpetrating, and inequalities and things that we have to work on. But for some reason, it's like forbidden to mention a bad word about the Israeli government, which is just, it's a wild thing for me to even fathom, but yeah.
Razzan, one of the most prominent and popular progressive Democrats in the U.S. is Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Just a few days back, she called Israel an apartheid state, and in a tweet, she wrote, "Apartheid states aren't democracies." We've also seen sentiments expressed by Palestinian American Representative Rashida Tlaib. She's another prominent progressive Democrat. She gave an impassioned speech on the floor of the House of Representatives and decried what she called Israel's apartheid government. How significant is it to you that you were hearing this word apartheid being uttered by U.S. legislators?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. I grew up, I've been born and raised in Palestine and Palestine. And it's always been the reality. We've named it such, we've been able to label it. But I always found, like going to pursue my higher education in the United States, simply identifying myself as Palestinian was already met with backlash, if not complete confusion. And so to have language calling it apartheid state, remembering that it's the United States, the president before Trump, that announced Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And so to have a dissenting voice, the voice that disrupts this and calls it as it is refreshing, it's invigorating, it's needed, as I hope to see occur in the United States itself, which is a settler colony, and many indigenous communities continue to struggle. And so I feel like this is one step towards collective liberation for all of us, all marginalized people.
Jesse, progressives in the Democratic Party and activists in the U.S., they're not just accusing Israel of apartheid practices. They're also, very much drawing parallels now between the plight of the Palestinians and injustices faced by Black Americans. And Palestinians are seeing a lot of solidarity being expressed from the Black Lives Matter movement. So how much of an impact is that having right now?
I think an enormous impact. I think that movement specifically, and all of these sort of satellite movements that grew along with it, really started a groundswell of activism, particularly, like you said before, with young people just really wanting to get out in the streets, wanting to disrupt, wanting to change things, being entirely impatient. Like People do not want to wait to get rid of systemic racism. People do not want to wait to get everyone health care in the United States. People do not want to wait. People do not want to, keep pushing money into this imperialist U.S. machine, into the war machine, into the, military industrial complex. And that specific movement for social and racial justice, I think it got people really fired up to make a change. And I think the organizing under it was incredible. And it's hard to, it's been remarkable, really, the impact of these social movements. I mean, like when I was in high school, right, even though I was pretty involved, far more involved than most people, especially in, towards the later years, we didn't go to protest though, and I can't speak for everyone, but now, I mean, I went to a rally right shortly after George Floyd in Long Island, New York, which is a pretty conservative place. And there were thousands of young people out there yelling and screaming and disrupting and taking over the streets. And it was absolutely incredible. So I think it definitely plays a role. People want to fight against oppression and fight for oppressed people all over the place. And this is a continuation of that, I think.
Omar, there's been so much reporting the last several days about how much pressure President Biden might be putting on Prime Minister Netanyahu in order to try to get a ceasefire to come about. Now, I've heard you say that a ceasefire alone will not resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict and that a ceasefire does not address these underlying issues that have been at play for so long. I mean, on Twitter, you wrote, "We remain far from justice." So from your vantage point, what are the steps that need to be taken to begin to address all of this on a fundamental and lasting level?
I think we should remember that Biden's initial response to Israel's devastation of Gaza was to insist that Israel was only defending itself and that it's not doing anything wrong and is not overreacting. He essentially reverted to the standard mantra of American presidents, which is to simply back Israel no matter what Israel does. And it was only intense pressure from within his own party, including a confrontation with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, a Palestinian American, by the way, which reminds you why representation actually matters, that he eventually changed his tune and started calling for de-escalation and telling Israel that he really expects a ceasefire to be in the works immediately. And what we currently need right now is to make sure that this pressure remains sustained. We can't have pressure on the Biden administration only when Israel is carrying out massive massacres against Palestinians. It has to be sustained during times of the status quo, which is the lower intensity violence that Palestinians are experiencing every single day. Just today, Israeli forces have attacked the Al-Aqsa compound once again, beating up and protesters and firing stun grenades. This is the reality of life for Palestinians every single day. They are under the complete and total control of the Israeli military. They have no voice. They have no right to vote for the government that controls their lives. They don't control their own borders. In the case of the people in Gaza, they do not even have access to clean water, do not have the ability to trade with the outside world. So they're completely economically suffocated. If they go out fishing, they get shot at by the Israeli Navy. This is an unacceptable reality right now where Palestinians do not have the most basics of human rights or any freedom at all. And as long as that injustice is in place, we are going to continue in a situation that is just bound to result in more and more violence. And you have the people in Sheikh Jarrah who are still under the threat of ethnic cleansing simply for being Palestinian. So if the United States is going to be serious about putting human rights first, as the Biden administration has repeated multiple times since he's taking office, then we need to see the Biden administration be held accountable to those words. And that comes through sustained and relentless pressure so that Israel, I'm pretty sure that what Netanyahu is counting on right now is that whatever pressure Biden came under was temporary and they can pull back a little bit, but then continue carrying on the way they have. But that is the fundamental issue. We have to get to a point where the United States does not supply unconditional military funding to Israel and does not offer unconditional diplomatic protection at the United Nations, vetoing every effort to hold Israel accountable if we're going to see a meaningful change. And that's precisely what we have to keep pushing for.
Jesse, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Omar was saying there, so I want to give you a chance to jump in.
Yeah, I just completely agree. I mean, this is not peace, right? This is a ceasefire. There is still, I've been seeing a lot of people just call for a sort of general peace, A general peace means an end to the occupation. A general peace means the U.S. finally standing up, right? The first settlements were built in 1967. You're talking about multiple decades. And the reason why they've expanded to 200 settlements and 600,000 people is that the largest imperial force in modern times backs up another enormous military to continue these type of things, to continue expanding territories, to continue denying Palestinians, like was just said, the right to vote, the right to travel freely, access to the same electrical grids, the same roads, the same water systems. I mean, me as an American Jew, I can go over there today and instantly, as soon as I get there, I have more rights than Palestinians who have been there for 80 years. And that just has to end. The United States has to show up here. And I think what was just said was spot on, which is, I think Biden is hoping now that this all settles down and he can just go back to the typical status quo for all American presidents, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter, which is just support Israel no matter what.
Razzan, I want to take a step back for a moment and mention the fact that over the last week, I've spoken to a lot of younger Palestinian activists who've said that what's important right now is that Palestinian activists are taking control of their own stories, that they are producing their own stories, and that is why this is resonating with the rest of the world and in the U.S. in a way that it hasn't in the past. Now, that's one thing, but do you believe that the shift that we're seeing happening when it comes to people identifying with the plight of Palestinians more than they have in the past, do you believe that this is going to lead to fundamental changes in policy, especially when it comes to the U.S. going forward?
Yeah, I'm not an oracle, so I can't fully deduce what the future is going to bring, but I can say that I am hopeful. I have faith in it. One thing that I feel is important to highlight, and Omar touched on, and Jesse as well, is that there is an assumption that systematic change occurs like this, like very quickly. And the truth is that people have been organizing, whether on Turtle Island in the United States and in various parts of Europe and in the global South for years, for decades. There's been mobilization on the ground. And I think what we're seeing now is the culmination and accumulation of labor by grassroots organizers and folks on the ground getting the message out there. I feel like it's also important to highlight in terms of like wanting to see this consistently into the future is to call upon folks, like when we hear, I think we start to hear a lot that people in Gaza don't have access to water, people in Gaza are cut off from this and that. And I want to say something. Many of us, all of us really, across borders have experienced what COVID-19 has caused in terms of quarantines, immense grief, the propelling of psychological disorders and difficulties in everyone's daily life, just simply being stuck in one's home. I want you to place that reality into a 15 years, like put that temporal scale into your imagination. I also want you to add to it that all over is rebel. I want you to add over that in the last attacks by Israel onto Gaza, they were aiming for people's joints, they were aiming for people's limbs, not only to harm a population, but to debilitate, to put an extreme healthcare cost, so that even in a dwindling infrastructure, how are you supposed to deal with this? How are you supposed to move when you're incapacitated and impaired in this way? And the third thing I really want to highlight about Gaza in terms of saying that the ceasefire is a ceasefire of aerial bombardment. It's not a cessation of the erection of illegal settlements. It's, as Omar mentioned, 15 so far have been injured in Al-Aqsa. What were people doing? They were celebrating. 15 injured. Right now in Bethlehem, another very historic and religious site, young people have been targeted with live bullets. This is happening right now. We speak. So although a ceasefire is announced, although I'm not a political analyst, and I trust what the people are sharing here to say that pressure has to be maintained on Biden. I want to remind Biden's the same one not so many years ago that said, "Oh, I love Israel so much. If it didn't exist, we'd have to create it." And this is an important thing for people to connect the dots to. I just like anyone else want to fight against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism should not be occurring. And at the same time, conflating anti-Semitism with any voice that's against oppression is violence towards our Jewish brothers and sisters and siblings. And so we need to really stand strong right now and recognize that, yes, the organizing occurring on Turtle Island, that's occurring in Palestine, occurring in multiple other places, is being done for the people, by the people. And that the only way for us to maintain that is not to back down, and for us to know that we understand what our aspirations and our dreams are.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. I want to thank all of our guests today, Omar Baddar, Razzan Quran, and Jesse Mechanic. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.